Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I might just remind people this would be a good time to mute your cell phones if you haven't already. Thank you. My name is Rob McDonald, and I'm the director of the Trent University Archaeological Research Center. And on behalf of TUARC, I welcome you to the Canadian Canoe Museum for a program celebrating the archaeology of dugout canoes. As is customary, I would like to begin by acknowledging that we are gathered here in the traditional and treaty lands and waters of the Mississauga and Anishinaabe. These lands and waters also hold special meaning for other Anishinaabe nations, as well as for the Huron-Wendat Nation and the Haudenosaunee of the Six Nations Confederacy. They say that actions speak louder than words, so I would like to add to these words my view that the work of archaeologists and museum professionals can be considered an active and ongoing form of land acknowledgement as we work with descendant communities to share the amazing stories of their ancestors as gleaned from the material evidence of the past. Tonight, we showcase and honor a lesser-known aspect of Indigenous maritime technology, the dugout canoe, which served communities throughout the Great Lakes region and beyond for thousands of years. Tonight's event is sponsored by TUARC in association with the Canadian Canoe Museum. Your access to the exhibition hall this evening was sponsored by ASI Heritage. I especially want to thank CCM Executive Director Carolyn Hislop, Curator Jeremy Ward, Program Manager Peter Voice, Programs Registrar Simone Romain, and TUARC Academic Administrative Assistant Yumi Pedo for their assistance in organizing this event. Before introducing our speakers tonight, I wish to acknowledge the attendance of several special guests. We are pleased to have with us tonight Dave Mowat, former chief of Alderville First Nation. Dr. Dan Longboat, Director of Indigenous Environmental Studies in the Channing Wenjack School for Indigenous Studies. Is Barbara Wall here? Okay, there were a few people that we invited that I don't know who, because of the weather, I guess weren't able to come. But I know that Tim Johnson, Senior Indigenous Curatorial Advisor to the Royal Ontario Museum, Senior Advisor for Heritage and Legacy at the Niagara Parks Commission, and Senior Advisor to the National Indigenous Organization Plenty Canada, is here with his wife Lisa. Oh. Our first speaker tonight is Jeremy Ward, Curator of the Canadian Canoe Museum. Earlier this month, Jeremy's extraordinary career was featured in the winter edition of the Trent magazine, published by the Trent University Alumni Association. A graduate of Trent in Canadian Studies and Indigenous Studies, Jeremy's amazing and varied career has included volunteering on an archaeological dig in Greece, working with Indigenous communities across the North, and a lot of hands-on experience learning about canoe craftsmanship. He came to the CCM as a volunteer in 1997 and joined the staff in 1998, and in 2008 he was appointed as curator. It gives me great pleasure to invite Jeremy Ward to the podium to share some of his thoughts and insights about dugout canoes.
Well, thank you very much, Rob. I should start by saying it is a true privilege to serve as the museum's curator here, although I'm joined by our associate curator tonight, Beth Stanley, an amazing colleague, and the rest of the staff team. We're also excited about tonight's conversation and to welcome you all here. And thank you for the land acknowledgement as well, Rob. Tonight is the first speakers night of a series for 2025, and I'm grateful you came out in the snow, the blowing weather that we have. We are also recording this, and it will be hosted online as a legacy from tonight and from the speaker series as well. So those of you who could not attend tonight due to inclement weather, we hope you'll find this in due course. I also want to thank TUARC for supporting tonight and Archaeological Services, Inc. We have long relationship with both organizations, going back over a decade and a half, and indeed longer for some past events, research, support with research, and it's really spurred on our thinking and understanding of the collection that we care for, and also guiding some of the outreach that we do as a result of stewarding the largest paddled watercraft collection in the world, and for that matter, probably the universe. But it's an important responsibility that we all carry. You did mention my years at Trent. I confess, abandon a master's program at the Frost Center as this extraordinary and somewhat crazy collection was rolling into town. This captured my interest to join this project. This organization was indeed begun here in Peterborough to take stewardship of this astonishing collection of watercraft by faculty of Trent University as well as some community members. But Trent has always been an important partner and certainly source of energy for the Canoe Museum over the years, dating right back to its very beginnings. When I say privilege of serving as curator, I would like to say that I'm just back from Temagami with my colleague Carolyn Heslop, our executive director, and our past chair, Vicki Grant. We're up on Lake Temagami and Temagami First Nation traditional territories, following a different canoe, not a dugout this time. This is a canoe that's new to this collection. It's extremely significant birch bark canoe made 115 years ago on the shores of Temagami waters. And it's been at a cottage for the last century, but it has had quite a storied life before and after it moved into that cottage. It'll be featured on an exhibit that'll open later this year. And our purpose for going up to Temagami First Nation the last 2 days was to meet community members and to talk a bit about the Canoe Museum and open that dialogue that is so important for organizations like museums that carry for the cultural belongings of families and individuals and communities. And that work is ongoing, and we hope you will come to an exhibit that opens in June of this year. As part of that, we sat in at a evening of memory that was being shared at the community hall on Bear Island. And the next day, we're honored to be taken out, not on snowshoes as we had planned, but in fact on skidoos for a much more ambitious trip. We were carried 75 kilometers up and through a range of lakes and creeks and winter portages to meet folks at a camp and to stop along the way and remember the places and the significance of moments across the landscape there, to stop at the pictographs and pay tribute to places of the ancients that remain today. And to go from there to meeting Dr. Sissel Schroeder and Rob and have the privilege of a walkabout in the collection hall today and briefly in the exhibits as well. We could have spent several days just talking and listening and sharing and reflecting in both spaces today. So I think it's the beginning of a longer relationship. I look forward to that. One of the questions, and I might just get this out of the way now, because it might come up. The museum's collection of canoes is not terribly ancient. We've given a fairly good assessment, and through support from Archaeological Services, we're able to do radiocarbon analysis on one canoe that showed the most promising. But in fact, the museum's watercraft collection is less than 300 years would be reasonably a safe guess. The oldest object in our care, and I didn't have a chance to tour everybody here in the collection hall, is actually in my pocket. It is a piece of chlorite schist, so it is much older than the part I'm going to talk about, but it was shaped by human hands downstream from where we are here, most likely at Healy's Falls on the what is now the Trent Seven Waterway System, at a groundstone tool production site. But what makes this really significant is that at one point this would have been hafted to a handle and used for carving out dugout canoes, likely made about 4,000 years ago. And so in a collection of watercraft that might be only centuries old, just looking out at the frozen Watanabe River tonight as it gets covered in snow, and thinking about this as just one of many, many, many ancient waterways throughout this region, it doesn't take much more than a glimpse of a piece of stone like this just to think about the antiquity of canoe cultures across Turtle Island. And I would love to share some of the amazing conversations we had today, but I know that I'll be overlapping into Sissel's talks tonight, so I'll leave it there. But thank you very much for everybody for coming out tonight and for you for joining us today.
Thank you, that was really nice.
Our special guest speaker tonight is Dr. Sissel Schroeder, professor in the Department of Anthropology at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Professor Schroeder is director of the Schroeder Laboratory of Wisconsin Archaeology, which includes among its many projects the Wisconsin Dugout Canoes Survey project that we're going to hear about tonight. Dr. Schroeder earned her doctorate in anthropology from the Pennsylvania State University in 1997. Her dissertation and subsequent research focused on Cahokia, a UNESCO World Heritage Site situated near the confluence of the Mississippi, Missouri, and Illinois rivers near East St. Louis, Illinois. Cahokia was the largest and most influential urban settlement of the Mississippian culture and the largest pre-contact indigenous city north of Mexico. At its height, around 1100 CE, it encompassed about 16 square kilometers and had an estimated population of 15 to 20,000 people. Dr. Schroeder's research also includes the contemporary Mississippian settlement of Aztalan, an earthwork settlement and National Historic Landmark situated in Aztalan State Park, about 40 kilometers east of Madison, Wisconsin. In addition to her many scholarly achievements and awards, last year Dr. Schroeder was elected as a Fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science in recognition of her distinguished work on behalf of the application of science in service to society. Since 2018, Professor Schroeder has been collaborating with Tamara Thompson, maritime archaeologist with the Wisconsin Historical Society's Maritime Preservation and Archaeology program, on the documentation of dugout canoes throughout the state of Wisconsin. The Wisconsin Dugout Canoe Survey Project has set the standard for investigation of these ancient watercraft, and we are delighted when she accepted our invitation to come and share the details of their work with us tonight. Please welcome Dr. Sissel Schroeder.
Thank you so much, Rob. You did your research, so that was a pretty thorough introduction. So tonight, I just really want to thank Rob and Jeremy and Carolyn and all the other staff here and at TUARC who have welcomed me into your homes and into your community with such great warmth. It's really, really overwhelming to be in a place that has such strong connections to Indigenous peoples and to canoes. And so I'm really grateful to be here and to have had some really great conversations today with people on the topic of dugout canoes. So tonight I'm going to share some of the work that Tammy and I have done on dugout canoes, and we've been working with many different partners, and some of the stuff that I'll talk about this evening is the work of Michael Wyman, our wood type specialist. So I've just put their identification or their affiliations up here on this slide. And I just want you to know that this is not a project I could have accomplished on my own. It has required interactions and collaborations with a lot of people, including our tribal partners in Wisconsin. Because dugout canoes are made of perishable material, they're relatively rare in museum collections, and I understand the Canadian Canoe Museum of the more than 600 has only 6 or 7, is that correct, of dugout canoes. And they're quite impressive. Many institutions that have dugout canoes may have only one or a fragment of one. To have 6 or 7 is really quite impressive. Dugout canoes are actually found all over the world. So despite my focus on Wisconsin, I want to acknowledge this global phenomenon. And they're found in places that had the availability of trees of a suitable size to make a dugout canoe. The oldest securely dated dugouts in the world date to the early Holocene, the geologic period that we are currently in, between about 6,000 and 9,000 years ago. And so far, dugouts dating to the Pleistocene, the last glacial period, have not been found. However, there are some distinctive wooden tools, like this adze, that have woodworking wear patterns on them that, and these date to the terminal Pleistocene, so about 11,500 to 12,000 years ago. These tool types are found in the mid-continent of North America, and they are a clue. These stone adzes, that distinctive polish, is the product of heavy woodworking. And when the edges were looked at under a microscope, the researchers who did this work could see microscopic pieces of charcoal in there. And so they drew the conclusion that these tools must have been used for woodworking and most likely for making dugout canoes. And so this is just a hint that dugout canoes in North America could be as much as 12,000 years old, which is kind of exciting to think about. We can surmise that watercraft date back much further in time because the paleo landmass that was called Sahul, encompassing present-day Australia, Tasmania, New Guinea, and the Aru Islands, was settled around 50,000 years ago, when the only possible route of travel across that ocean separating the continent of Sunda from Sahul would have required watercraft. We think it was most likely rafts, but it may have been some kind of more formal watercraft. And like me, most of you in the audience are probably avid paddlers. You might not have come to this talk if you weren't, or you might have been dragged here. And consequently, you probably have a close working relationship with your kayak or your canoe and your paddle, and you're reluctant to let anybody else use them. And you might even go so far as I did this past summer, that my kayak will go with me into the wilderness rather than borrow or rent a kayak. My paddle will also come with me. Because many of us have our own experience with the self-propelled watercraft, and maybe even read a little bit about dugout canoes, like the preference for using softwoods like pine or other kinds of softwoods, it can be easy to think that we already know pretty much everything there is to know about this type of technology. But what if we really don't know the whole story? What if there's still more to discover? And our work in Wisconsin is significantly adding to our knowledge of First Nations watercraft, maritime history, and Indigenous ecological knowledge and technological innovations. And tonight I'm going to share with you some of the things we've learned by interrogating the conventional wisdom about dugouts during our research on log dugouts, log canoes from Wisconsin. Now, I have the great privilege of being at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, which sits on the south edge of a big lake, Lake Mendota. And so it's very easy to pop your kayak or your canoe into the water. And here we have Carla Viju, who's Oneida, Catherine Ryland, and Bill Quackenbush, who's Ho-Chunk, in a dugout canoe that Bill Quackenbush made with the Ho-Chunk youth, out on some pretty choppy water on Lake Mendota one day this past fall. And I had a borrowed kayak. I should have brought my own. I was in one of those very lightweight yellow kayaks, and my kayak is like bouncing all over in the choppy water. We had like 15 to 20 mile an hour winds. That dugout canoe was the most solid watercraft I had ever had the privilege to see, paddled watercraft I'd ever had the privilege to see. It was really a great reminder and lesson in what is so important about dugouts, and also for me, how I still have so much more to learn. So before getting into the specifics of our research in Wisconsin, I'm going to go over what we know, or at least what we think we know, about dugout canoes in eastern North America. Much of what we know about how dugouts were used and produced prior to the widespread introduction of European iron tools comes from written accounts of the 16th century Spanish and Portuguese invasions into southeastern North America and the French, Dutch, and English incursions into northeastern North America in the 17th and 18th centuries. In the mid-16th century, there was an Englishman who spent a fair amount of time in what was then called Virginia, named Thomas Harriot. And he observed indigenous peoples making canoes and was able to describe it so vividly. And he also had an artist with him named John White, that John White, between these descriptions and his own observations, was able to create a watercolor of what dugout canoe manufacture looked like. And the watercolor has not survived, but Theodore de Bry captured it in an etching and then hand-colored that etching to depict indigenous people using fire around the base of a tree in order to fell the standing tree to then turn that into a dugout. And then you see in the large image hollowing out the dugout with the help of fire, stone hatchets, and shells. Much of the literature on dugout wood type emphasizes softwoods like pine, which are relatively or more easily worked with stone tools and shell tools than would be the case with hardwoods. And softwoods are also relatively light in weight, and pine in particular has a pitch in its cells that would have helped with fire, would have helped the combustibility of the manufacturing process, making it an easier wood to work. And so a lot of the literature really emphasizes the value of softwoods to the manufacture of dugout canoes. I did a survey of the literature and found 174 dugout canoes reported in the literature for Eastern North America that had wood type reported. And 92% of those dugouts were made out of softwoods, and only 8% were made out of hardwoods. And this is even after, this includes dugouts that date after the introduction of iron tools. And I'm going to come back to this a little bit later, this image a little bit later in the talk. To our knowledge, the earliest documented iron tools found in association with Native American sites were introduced by De Soto in the Southeast in the 16th century. But in the Western Great Lakes, iron tools were not readily available until the sustained presence of the French in the 17th and 18th centuries. And once iron tools were available, they were very quickly adopted to replace stone and shell tools to hollow out a log to make a dugout, made it for a more efficient process. Fire was still commonly used, as we see here with Bill Quackenbush as he's working on the Ho-Chunk dugout. This was a project done with tribal youth. I haven't been able to find a picture of tribal youth helping Bill, but I know that they were there. And once, fire doesn't have to be part of the manufacturing process when you're using metal tools in the same way that it would have to be for stone and shell tools, but it still does hasten the process. This particular dugout is made out of a cottonwood tree. So it's, I don't know if that is like on the border between soft and hard. Here, the Ho-Chunk paddled that very same dugout through the 4 lakes in Madison that are part of their traditional territory that they call Dugout. And just as the case in the present, these canoes were important for a variety of activities, including recreation, as we can see in this George Catlin painting of the Hidatsa village up the Missouri River. Also, basic transportation and on lakes and rivers by First Nations people, as we see here in this image of a Ho-Chunk man in a dugout canoe on the Black River. And commerce. Here is an early fur trader with his Métis son in a dugout descending the Missouri River. And it has an interesting backstory. So this is the audience participation part of the evening. What do you see in the front of the dugout? A cat, a black cat. That sure is what it looks like in this painting. But it's actually a bear cub. And this is a painting by George Caleb Bingham. And 6 years after he did this painting, he kind of redid the same scene, gave it a different title, and here he actually made it look like a bear cub. It helped me understand better why that cat was leashed in place at the front of the canoe, because any cat I've ever encountered stuck in a canoe was not going to make a break for it. Dugouts, of course, were also used for fishing. This is a John White watercolor, one of the few that has survived. And even whaling, as seen in this DeBry engraving that is possibly of Newfoundland, Indigenous peoples, First Nations peoples in Newfoundland. And surely whaling has to be the most hazardous use of a dugout as watercraft that I've ever come across. So with this broad context in mind and behind us, I'm going to turn now to talk about the Wisconsin Dugout Canoe Survey project in particular. And I'm going to go through the research methods and process that we used. I know that there are some students in the room, and maybe you'll get inspired by some of this. I'm going to talk a little bit about the fundamental original field research that we've done, the substantial collections-based research that we have accomplished by visiting many different institutions, and our commitment to collaboration and engagement and partnership with a wide range of stakeholders, particularly our tribal partners. But I want to tell you the story of how this project began. An undergrad history major named Ryan Smozzle approached my colleague Tammy. He was really eager to gain some research experience in underwater archaeology, but he wasn't dive trained. He wasn't dive certified. And so he had approached Tammy at the Wisconsin Historical Society. She is the underwater archaeologist at the Wisconsin Historical Society, which it happens to be conveniently located on the UW-Madison campus next door to the history building. So very, very easy way to communicate back and forth. And because he didn't have dive experience, he was not going to be able to join Tammy and her crew on any of their underwater archaeology projects on Lake Superior or Lake Michigan. And so she thought, well, we've got this file in our office of dugout canoes. There are 11 dugout canoes that appear in the file. This seems like a pretty manageable project for him. Maybe he'll find some additional dugout canoes. And so this is a dugout canoe at the Wisconsin Maritime Museum in Manitowoc, Wisconsin, and I helped him with the documentation of this. And this dugout did turn out to predate the European presence in Wisconsin, so that was kind of cool. So at the start of this project, the file that Tamara handed Ryan had, as a starting point, had records on 11 dugouts. And I should add that why am I part of this project? Ryan and Tamara are talking back and forth with each other. Well, he wanted to do a senior thesis. He got so excited about the 11 dugout canoes, he wanted to do a senior thesis. He was a history student, and the history advisor was just, not real sure that this would be a project that might fly with the history department. They thought it was more of an archaeology project. So Tamara said, go see Sissel. She loves to paddle. She'll probably be interested. And of course, I was very interested. So at the start, we had 11 dugouts, and they ranged in age from about 150 years old to a fragment of a dugout that was radiocarbon dated to 1,850 years old. We certainly suspected that there would be more dugouts in collections of local historical societies and museums around the state if we just reached out and looked. And so with Ryan's interest really blossoming, we guided him to reach out to local historical societies. I provided some guidance on some of the STEM aspects of the research, including 3D modeling. And we both assisted with his canoe visits around the state. So we both quickly developed a kind of sense of how dugouts varied in appearance. They did not all look the same. I'm not sure if we expected that they would at the beginning, but we didn't have a whole lot of experience at the start. By the time Ryan finished his thesis, he had identified 34 dugouts across Wisconsin, and he had documented 26 of them. After he graduated, he went on to graduate study in the UK, and Tammy and I thought, well, it can't be that difficult to get another 8 dugouts. So he graduated in 2019. Tammy was in the field during the summer. I was very busy. Throughout that year, I was the chair of my department, as well as teaching. And so we ended up being too busy to work on this project in 2019. And then we all know what happened at the beginning of 2020. And so the world shut down. We're all hunkered down in our homes, working remotely. And Tammy was assigned to other duties. As chair of my department, I was swamped with ever-changing administrative guidance on how to handle it. And initially we thought we'd all be back in the classroom in 3 weeks, and then it was 3 months, and then it just sort of went out of control from there. But we were keeping our eyes open. Both Tammy and I were keeping our eyes open for any kind of references for dugouts. And we came across some, and Tammy scanned some newspapers. I was doing some reading of old ethnographies. So we came across a few references. But there was a big sort of game changer to our whole thing. And an important thing to know about Tamara is that she loves to dive. She lives to dive. She's one of the best technical divers in the world. She was inducted into the Women Divers Hall of Fame in 2014. And she happens to live on Lake Mendota in her grandparents' home. And her office overlooks Lake Mendota. My office overlooks Lake Mendota. So we're very closely attached to this water. In her free time, she often ventures out into the lake with friends, diving to follow fish, pick up trash on the bottom of the lake, and explore the many kind of weird and odd things that have ended up into the bottom of the lake, from old cars to this abandoned 3-person underwater research pod that UW-Madison placed on the bottom of the lake in the late 1970s to put people at the bottom of the lake so they could sample lake sediments and lake water while actually at the bottom of the lake, and they could do it over time. Kind of a crazy thing. Obviously, it didn't really last because they just abandoned it on the bottom of the lake. Well, one weekend, she and a friend were returning from diving along the southern shore of Lake Mendota, and when she noticed a piece of wood sticking out of the sediment in the bottom of the lake, and this was before she'd completely uncovered it, she and her friend were low on air, and she just sort of wrote in her write-on notebook, "I think this is a dugout canoe," and the friend is like, we're on a time clock here. So Tammy calculated how much time it took for her to and her friend to get back to their boat. And then she came back later in the day with the assistant state archaeologist. This is a weekend. She called the assistant state archaeologist up and said, "Hey, would you come out with me? I think I found something kind of interesting, but I need somebody to be on top of the boat when I dive." And she was able to confirm that it really was a dugout canoe. And it had some stones in the bottom of it. She brought those up to show to the assistant state archaeologist, who kind of looked at them and it was initially like, well, they're just rocks, and then noticed that they were all about the same size, about the size of her hand, and some of them had little notches on the sides. So these were artifacts. These were net weights. The net had long since decayed, but the weights were still present in the bottom of this dugout. Later, the Historical Society obtained a radiocarbon date for this dugout, and we were all very surprised when it turned out to be 1,200 years old. So surprised that the state archaeologist at the time, Jim Skibo, said, "Yeah, we're redating this. We're sending it to another lab. It can't possibly be 1,200 years old." But it was. The second lab confirmed it. So he and Tammy worked on developing a plan to raise the dugout, preserve it, and feature it in the new history center that Wisconsin was in the planning phase of at the time. And they're still kind of in the planning and development phase. So boy, that just like made the news internationally. Some of you may have even heard of the Lake Mendota dugout. Well, a year later, Tammy was on another recreational dive when she noticed another dugout along the shores of Lake Mendota, not far from the first dugout, And this one turned out to be 3,000 years old. So she and Jim Skibo worked on a plan to raise this dugout and preserve it. And our tribal partners have been involved with the Lake Mendota project from the very beginning, assisting with canoe preservation, canoe recovery. Here you see Larry Plachinsky of the Bad River Band and Lucas and Bill Quackenbush from the Ho-Chunk. Bill Quackenbush from the Ho-Chunk has taken the lead in developing methods to do sort of surveys for the dugout canoes on the bottom of Lake Mendota without actually having to dive. And one approach that he's taken is bringing ground penetrating radar out through the ice. Here he is with one of my graduate students, Miranda, on the coldest day of this winter. I think it was 2022. And on the right is Tammy with Bill Quackenbush on the warmest day of that winter when we were more than ankle deep in water crossing and slush over the ice. You all know what that experience is like, I am sure. And Bill even took the ground penetrating radar instrument out on open water by setting it in the bottom of the dugout canoe that he had made, and then having it run alongside the Boston Whaler that the underwater archaeology program at the Historical Society uses. So we've now identified 10 dugout canoes in a cluster along the southern shore of Lake Mendota. And the total number of Wisconsin dugouts that have been reported to us for our study has grown to more than 110 reports of dugouts that originated in the state, and including the 10 in Lake Mendota, and we've examined 79 of them. 15 have been lost or destroyed, and we still have a number to track down, which we will trace and track down, which we will continue doing. This quantity of dugouts puts Wisconsin second behind Florida in eastern North America for the number of reported dugouts. Florida is kind of not a fair comparison. There are more than 400 dugouts that have been found in that state. They have some unique preservation settings with springs and caves and peat bogs. They had 101 that came out of a single lake, Noonan's Lake. But this also means that Wisconsin has by far the largest number of reported dugout lakes in the dugout canoes in the Great Lakes. So we've been dating the dugouts as we study them. We've been collecting wood, and we've dated about 70 of them so far. And they range in age from 80 years old, which is a historically documented manufacturing date, to nearly 4,500 years old. That means we've got 3 of the 11 or 12 oldest dugouts in eastern North America in Wisconsin waters. The oldest are in Florida, and then the others are from the southeast. So this is a pretty interesting and remarkable finding. It makes these dugouts really very special in terms of the Indigenous peoples, the First Nations of Wisconsin, having such a tangible series of artifacts that connect them to the deep past in our state. So much of I'm going to go through sort of briefly our methods. Much of our work actually started with archival research to find reports of dugouts and then do the legwork to try and actually find the dugouts. And sometimes there was one dugout that we were looking for that was in a town that had been settled by people who had 2 last names, and still everybody in the town seemed to have one of those 2 last names. And trying to track down the person was a bit of calling this person and this person and this person, and finally getting somebody who said, well, I'm not the Bill you want. This is the Bill you want. I'll give you his name. But in preparing for this talk, I came across a passage in Edward Rogers' 1965 article on the dugout canoe in Ontario that really piqued my interest. And it tells the story or the account of Mrs. Medford Chetchok, a former resident of the French River Reserve, who recounted how her grandmother's sister brought back a dugout on her return from Wisconsin. And this was after her Menominee husband had passed away. So it was from the time of her husband's death. So I'm just going to make an appeal to you out there. If you know of where Mrs. Medford Chechawk's canoe might be today. I would really love to know about it. Both Tammy and I would really like to track this one down. Much of our research has involved visiting collections like the amazing collection here. They're housed in all different kinds of places and conditions, and it was really heartwarming to see how well cared for the dugouts are here at the Canadian Canoe Museum, as well as all of the other canoes here. We've been in hardware stores, people's garages, the rafters of barns. We've been in just about every kind of condition you might imagine. And our research has taken us all over Wisconsin, but it's also taken us to New York City, Washington, D.C., Maryland, Nebraska, places where dugout canoes that were made in Wisconsin ended up in more distant collections. We've also done some primary field research to follow up on reports of dugouts that we receive, whether it be a lake or a river. And sometimes, yes, there actually is a dugout there, and sometimes, as is the case in where we're wading into the water, there was not a dugout, there was just a tree fall. Our methods of documenting the dugouts start with recording basic quantitative data and categorical information for each dugout canoe. We measure them using traditional baseline maritime survey methods to record length, width, depth of hold. We sketch them on graph paper along with descriptive notes that might describe the presence or absence of metal tool marks, the presence or absence of thwarts, evidence of burning, patches. I saw a dugout canoe today that had been entirely patched, all surfaces with metal. We've seen some others with the patches are quite a bit smaller. Paint, which might cover the entire interior and exterior of the dugout, or may have been used to paint designs on the prow of the boat, as we see here with a dugout at the Menominee Logging Museum and another one that was Chief Ackley's dugout from Mole Lake in Wisconsin that is at the Camp 5 Logging Museum. Keels are really rare. Most of the dugouts that we see have kind of a arched bottom or a flat bottom. But we have two in our sample that seem to have been carved in a manner to create a kind of pointed keel along the midline of the canoe that this may have been done to help navigation on particular types of waterways. We're reaching a sample size where we're starting to see similarities among some dugouts. And this may enable us to start to identify dugouts to a particular maker, shared practices within a tribe, or a temporal trend. And this carved upturned end that you see on these Ho-Chunk and Menominee dugouts, they all date to the 1800s, very late 1700s, first half of the 1800s. And so this may have been the result of an effort to make the profile of these dugout canoes look more like a birch bark canoe. Birch bark canoes may have reached this sort of iconic idea of what a dugout canoe, or what a canoe should look like. What should a canoe look like? There may have been other reasons that they started to do this, but it's very much associated with Indigenous made canoes from beginning in the very late 1700s, early 1800s. We request permission to take small samples of wood about the size of a matchstick. And we try to do these from the outermost rings of the tree that we can see on the dugout. We try to take them also from a place that will not be highly visible if the dugout is exhibited. And we do this so that we can identify the species of wood that was used to make the dugout, radiocarbon dating, and strontium isotope analysis for dugouts that were never submerged. And that might help us determine where within the state the tree had grown. We've got a number of dugouts that don't have great provenience information. And then we also photograph each dugout from multiple angles with a GoPro camera to produce a 3D photogrammetry model in a program called Metashape Pro. And it can take an hour or two to build the photogrammetry model. So we're able to see if the model was successful while we're still on site. And if it wasn't, then we can also see where we need to take more pictures, more images or maybe we need to get better lighting. And then partway through this project, we have benefited from a significant technological advancement that came with the release of the iPhone 12 Pro and all subsequent Pro models. And usually at this point in the talk, everybody pulls out their phones to look to see if they have a Pro model with a LiDAR sensor, a light radar sensor in it. And this turns the phone into a handheld scanning device. And we use an app called Scaniverse. It's free to scan the dugouts. And it takes about 15 minutes to pass the phone back and forth over the dugout, getting it from all possible angles. And here I'm working on a dugout canoe at the Smithsonian Museum's curation facility outside of Washington, D.C. As you can see, there's some squats that are in here. I have to crawl under the dugout at various times. But once it's done, it takes less than a minute to build the model, and then you instantly have a 3D model that's interactive, and it can be exported in multiple file formats, including video, which can be shared immediately with the institutions that we're at. They can choose to post it to social media if they want, use it in any of their kind of promotional materials. Both the photogrammetry and Scaniverse models can be uploaded to a website called Sketchfab, where users can interact with the models themselves. You can go in, spin it around, zoom in, zoom out, look at the dugout from any angle that you want to. And certainly the models that we make using the Apple iPhone, the measurements are in there. The GoPro ones, we have to do some backside work to get the measurements in. And in addition, we can print 3D models, like this model of the first dugout that we recovered from Lake Mendota, that can be used in educational programming. And one of our team members, Jordan, has uploaded 3D models of dugout canoes into a virtual reality headset, which offers another way for people to experience the canoes when we do public outreach events in large spaces. And we attach a television monitor as well, so the people who aren't wearing the headset are able to see what the person wearing the headset is seeing and doing. And so these are just multiple ways that we can bring these dugout canoes in larger numbers to people in the public. So as our research began to kind of grow, as this sample size in particular began to grow, Tammy and I developed several research questions that we wanted to investigate, doing more than just documenting the dugouts. And for Ryan's work, it was mostly about documenting the dugouts using a variety of different techniques. But we got interested in understanding where are dugouts found? What kind of depositional context are they in? Do the size, form, and other attributes of dugouts vary across space and through time? Does wood type vary across space and through time? Does wood type align with paleo-ecological records, especially for the older dugouts? And what new insights into Indigenous ecological knowledge, technological skill, cultural practices, and innovation can be drawn from this data set and through consultation with our tribal partners? So these are just some of the broad research questions that we had. And what I'm going to go through next is just how we have addressed these particular research questions. To start with, this infographic shows where dugouts were found for canoes in our sample that predate the 20th century. So these are canoes from the 1900s and earlier. And nearly 3/4 of them have been found submerged in water, or they've been found adjacent to a lake or to a river. 13% are ethnographic in origin from the late 1800s, either collected by ethnographers or purchased by ethnographers and interested people in the late 19th, early 20th century. And then the remainder are either non-Indigenous in origin or have no information regarding where they were found. So basic takeaway is they're mostly found in or near water, not unexpected. but we just wanted to actually confirm this. The intact dugouts in our study range from about 2¼ meters in length to 11 meters in length, with an average of about 4.3, and most are between 3 and 5 meters. So they're kind of on the smaller size for dugout canoes. The shortest dugout in our sample that's intact is Lake Mendota number 3, which is about 2,000 years old. It was too fragile to bring up from the bottom of the lake, and so it was reburied in lake bottom sediment after being documented. The longest dugout in our sample, at about 11 meters, is at a historical society in northern Wisconsin. And their story is that the dugout was used in the early to mid 1800s by a trapper named Davidson to transport supplies on the Chippewa River from Chippewa Falls northwards. This dugout also has another interesting story. It's in a replica of a settler's cabin, colonial settler's cabin, and it was built around the dugout, and then like 20 years later or so, they had to move the building, and they couldn't get the dugout out. So they had to move the building with the dugout in it, which took a little bit more engineering than I think they had planned on. So this statement brought up kind of a query in my mind, and that was, where are these dugouts being used if we see this range in size? And we know in the southeast that dugouts were, not often, but they sometimes would reach a length of like 15 meters, so longer than what we see. So in the 17th century, Marquette and Joliet traveled the waterways of eastern North America. And their map shows a Peoria village at the confluence of the Mississippi River and the Des Moines River, with a notation in French about the size of the community. And in translation, it indicates the presence of 300 cabins and 180 wooden canoes of 50 feet or 15¼ meters in length. And that's similar to the longest intact dugout that's been found to date in the southeast, and certainly early Spanish accounts of dugouts just describe them as being very long and filled with multiple warriors on the lower Mississippi River. Although it's important to recognize that the Spaniards exaggerated size on a regular basis, whether it be the size of the crowd or the size of whatever they saw. In paleodemographic research, it's common to assume 5 people per structure if you're trying to make any sort of demographic population estimates. And so it's commonplace to take the number of structures at an archaeological site that have been excavated. You have the plan view, you know the sizes, make some assumptions, 5 people per structure. So doing that here with the cabins, which were probably teepees, gives a population size of 1,500 people in this community at the confluence of the Des Moines and Mississippi rivers. Now, assuming that all of these people traveled by canoe, this would mean an average of 8 people per dugout, which happens to be the number of people shown in the dugout that is your museum logo. This is the image in the lower left is from Selwyn Dudney's book, and he describes this as a dugout canoe, although I think I maybe should be a little suspect of that description. I'm not sure. Anyway, I wanted to bring this in because it's magic with numbers, but it also connects with your beautiful, beautiful image. So in Wisconsin, most of our dugouts are about 1/3 of the size reported for the Peoria, and perhaps better suited to carrying 2, maybe 3 people, as in these shell engravings from a site in Oklahoma called Spiro. And these images date to probably about AD 1100. They're the only dugouts, and they're the only watercraft that I am aware of in Mississippian art from the southeastern United States. And note that these canoes also appear to have painted designs on the exterior, and they have some objects inside them that were probably set into countersunk holes on the bottom of the dugouts. So, We've got a few working hypotheses about dugout length. One is that length relates to the use of the dugout, but other than the very long dugout used by traders to haul goods up the Chippewa River, we don't really know how dugouts were used in the past. I talked earlier about the different ways in which we think we know how they were used. And we surmise that they were built as multi-purpose craft. They weren't built as a single kind of craft. But this is not a hypothesis that is testable. The results really present us with some issues of equifinality. A second hypothesis is that dugouts varied in size through time. And so we've gotten radiocarbon dates on a large number of these dugouts. And so I did a statistical analysis, and it yielded a p-value, a significance level, well above 0.05, which is usually what scientists want, because then that means that there's a 95% probability that the relationship they have identified is real. Well, it's not anywhere close to that. And so this is really actually much easier to see on this scatter plot of age along the bottom and length, and you can pretty much see that there's no good relationship between length and time. So we rejected that hypothesis. A third hypothesis is that the size of the dugouts is related to the kind of water on which they were used, with shorter dugouts used on inland lakes, oxbow lakes, and larger dugouts used on rivers and big water. So here we calculated a t-test to compare the mean lengths of dugouts found on lakes versus those found in rivers, or near lakes, near rivers. And here the p-value is slightly above 0.05, but it's not much above 0.05. So we argue that this offers weak support for our hypothesis that dugout size is actually related to the size of water, the kind of water on which it was used. And so the very large dugouts reported in Marquette and Joliet's map and in the southeast makes sense, because those are watercraft used on the lower Mississippi River, which is a big river, and used along the Gulf coastal plain. So turning now to wood type, I'm getting close to the end here. This is the one I really geeked out about. Oh my gosh. As I mentioned earlier in the talk, when we look at dugouts from across eastern North America, 92% are made of softwoods. Well, when we did this for Wisconsin, roughly 2/3 are made of softwoods and fully 1/3 are made of hardwoods, including white oak, elm, juglans, which could include butternut or walnut, basswood, cottonwood, ash, and red oak. So this makes the Wisconsin assemblage stand out as kind of unique with regard to wood type in terms of diversity of types of wood that were used across the state, as well as the significantly greater representation of hardwoods. Well, why? Why do we see so many more hardwood dugout canoes in Wisconsin? There are a lot more work to make, certainly. Well, when I plotted the locations of these dugout finds on a map of the 19th century public land survey data on witness trees in the state, there's a correlation between wood type and vegetation from the 19th century local forest ecology. Most of the white pine dugouts, which are shown in white with a green circle around them, are coming from the northern part of the state, which you can see is kind of blanketed in green, indicating that it's mostly pine forest. We see pine along the eastern side of Wisconsin. That's adjacent to Lake Michigan. The soils are sandier, and so we do see more pine there even today. And then all of or most of the hardwood dugouts are coming from the southern part of the state, which was oak forest and oak savanna in the 19th century. So hardwood forests in the southern third of the state, softwood forests in the northern third of the state, and it looks like the wood choice that people made was to work with locally available wood when that was possible, which it really was, because much of Wisconsin was forested. So two wood types have been really surprising to us. The most surprising was elm, and Jeremy was like, elm? Who would work elm? I mean, hardwoods are hard enough. Why would you pick elm? It's a wood type that's really difficult to work because it has this bizarre interlocking grain. It doesn't split. You don't see elm cabinetry or elm flooring or elm furniture. Well, the dugouts that have been identified as elm all date to between about 4,000 years ago and 4,500 years ago. And they're all from Lake Mendota, one of the best studied lakes in the world. So we have pollen analysis, pollen cores from the study from the lake that have been analyzed, oxygen isotope studies on the same sediment core, carbon isotope studies on the same sediment core. And what we see here is in the red box is that time span for those elm canoes. And all of the data from these cores indicates that the climate in southern Wisconsin was warmer and drier than it is now. And this is reflected in the reduction of oak pollen. And so this mid-Holocene warm period began around 5,500 years ago and ended around 3,000 years ago. And so these elm canoes in the Lake Mendota fall within this mid-Holocene warm and dry climatic conditions. Under these conditions, closed canopy forests, particularly closed canopy oak forests, will open up to a more oak savanna environment. And oaks growing under these conditions tend to start branching close to the ground. So you don't get a long trunk that doesn't have branches that would create knots that might be less desirable in a canoe. However, so maybe these were less well suited to dugout construction. Elm, on the other hand, whether it grows in a closed canopy environment or an open environment, grows on a long, tall, straight trunk, and then it has this it's like flowers in a narrow vase that branch out at the top. So we would argue that this type of tree was better suited to the form of a dugout canoe, and that indigenous people figured out how to work a wood that no contemporary woodworker would touch, with their power tools, no less. So this slide shows the oldest dugouts in Wisconsin, from the 4,000, 4,500-year-old dugouts with elm to one dugout dating about 3,000 years ago made of ash, which is getting into that's that transition period, the end of the mid-Holocene warm period. And then there's a gap of about 1,000 years before we see a number of dugouts dating between roughly 2,000 and 800 years ago, made mostly of oak. We've got one cottonwood sample. And the second surprising wood type to us was red oak. Now, wrong direction. And this dugout is still in Lake Mendota. I think we're all familiar, we're all adults, that white oak is used to barrel age whiskey, bourbon, tequila, brandy, Chardonnay, even some beer gets aged in white oak. But you never hear about red oak being used to barrel age any kind of alcoholic beverage. And that's because red oak has got a very porous grain. White oak has a very closed grain. So the bottom block of wood is white oak. And you can see that the wood is quite dense. The top piece is red oak. Sorry, wrong direction. And you can see the open pores. And that means that it's not a watertight wood. You're not going to put liquids into a type of wood used to make barrels when the wood is porous like this. So why do we have a dugout in Lake Mendota that is made of red oak? Well, it turns out that the specific red oak tree used to make this Lake Mendota number 6 dugout, and it's our numbers, these are arbitrary numbers we've given based on the order in which we have found them. This dugout was special, the wood was special. So this is a thin section slide of standard red oak, stained red to highlight the open cellular structure that makes the wood so porous. And these are slides of the red oak used to build the Lake Mendota dugout. And all of the open cells are filled with growth called tyloses. These are sort of balloon-like outgrowths that form in the cells of the wood, and they block the movement of water through the wood, making the wood more watertight and more durable. These are naturally in white oak, which is why white oak is so dense, but they are not natural in red oak. They only appear in red oak if the tree has been damaged in a particular way at a particular point in its growth life cycle, or if the tree has been diseased. And so injury or disease, or intentional injury or diseases then change the permeability of red oak wood, but this is very rare in terms of it's something that happens naturally. We think that the ecological knowledge of the indigenous peoples who made this canoe of red oak extended to knowing how to induce the growth of tyloses in the tree to make the wood watertight, or being able to recognize the kinds of diseases that might have led a red oak to develop tyloses and be watertight. And that, we think, is just, this study is revealing to us again and again and again ingenuity and knowledge that we did not previously recognize as in the indigenous population. So to just tie it up, what did we learn? Well, many, many more dugouts than we ever expected. Oh my gosh. Dugouts have a wider range of dates than we ever expected, and we have a significant number of really old dugouts, mostly in Lake Mendota. Most dugouts are found in or near water, which makes a lot of sense for wooden watercraft, of course. Dugout length varies with weak statistical support for our hypothesis that length and size is related to use on rivers versus big water. And then probably one of our biggest findings is, and it's a contribution to knowledge about dugout canoes from around the world, and that is that the assumption that softwoods would be preferred probably is not an accurate assumption. Instead, what we see is that people make choices based on the wood that are available. And so those choices are not as limited as archaeologists and anthropologists and even historians have generally thought or written about. And then indigenous made dugouts from the late 18th to 19th century are stylistically distinctive from earlier dugouts and even from later dugouts. Perhaps for the appearance of the upturned ends of a birch bark canoe, we don't really know. And then again, I think another really important contribution of this study is that dugouts offer new and unique insights into indigenous ecological knowledge, technological innovation, and skill, including mastering the methods of working with elm and possibly knowing how to manipulate wood to make it watertight or recognize the conditions that might turn a porous wood into something that is watertight. And finally, I would just like to say that even fragments tell a story. Many institutions that we have reached out to that reportedly had a dugout canoe told us that they'd burned it or thrown it away because it was broken. And these are both broken, obviously broken, but we can learn about the wood type, radiocarbon dates, and with dendrochronology, as we're doing with the Lake Delavan dugout, we can get information on climate history that's encoded in the tree rings. So even if a dugout is in poor and fragmentary condition, it still has research value. So thank you so much. I just want to acknowledge our funding. Most importantly, our partners. We extend our thanks to all the places and people who have helped us with access to dugout canoes, who have helped us push this research in new directions. Without their participation, this project would not have been possible. And if you'd like to know more, you can visit my website. Thank you so much.